Every now and then, every good player makes a stumble. Sometimes we project things that just don't happen. Sometimes we play poorly. Sometimes we just bring the wrong deck. In all honesty, this past weekend, I played in the 10K at the CCS. And on the first day, I decided to play the Doc Aggro deck that we last updated our uh, guide with on the Metafy. What I liked about the deck is that it really did feel like it was positioned well. It felt like everything was going to be in a direction that was good for Doc Aggro. But in the end, there were still mistakes made in deck building. I kind of want to walk through that deck today, along with some other decks that were kind of being discussed and being talked about as potential options during the time between the release of Azurite C and EUCC, and then talk about the next few weeks of what I could be testing for NACC as well. Without further ado, let's get into the deck that I played this past weekend that was designed by Dick Burns. So this past weekend, the CCS10k, we played Doc Aggro. And as you can see here, it's a little bit different from things of the past. We bring back friends on the other side. We go down on libraries. We go to Brooms with no fire the cannons. And some notable here is that we bring back Mr. Arrow, or actually we're actually trying out Mr. Aggro now more than anything. And besides that, we also get back Cusco. Now you can see here from the difference makers, there are still 4 snakes, there are still 4 fox, 4 rose, 3 goat, 1 genie, and 4 docs. We also bring back an old friend, Pascal, that was pretty formidable for us in Vegas. But the fundamental issues with this list is that while on the play, it feels quite favorable in most cases, there is worlds where we stumble. Now that we have so many 1 strength characters or below, we are very vulnerable to human Sisu. In all honesty, I lost a game on the play against Ruby Sapphire just because of Iceblock Human Sisu. In general, they were able to basically say every one of my characters minus Rose, Goat, Fox, and Snake, which are all 1 lore characters, and of course me, were able to just be human Sisu with 1 ice block. That was definitely a problem when I went and paid 4 ink for a genie, drew my card, and the next turn they just ice blocked it, played a Sisu, and removed it. Definitely didn't feel good. Mr. Arrow on 2 went on the draw, and my opponent's turn 3 was just human Sisu to remove Mr. Arrow. Felt really miserable. I just couldn't really maintain pressure, and there was also really no way to kind of close out the game. With only 2 library, it's unreliable to get this on in every game, and that's kind of become a bit of a problem for this list as well. You just weren't able to finish out or close out games by drawing multiple cards. With only 2 of these, you're never finding it. We're also not gaining that conditional lore as well. Babooms are strictly worse than Fire the Cannons. It's one thing if we want to play Fire the Cannons and complement it with Baboom to have, backup kind of in a way. But the real truth is by not playing Fire the Cannons, only playing 2 Babooms, your worst, or I should say your best opening lines that are, a Maleficent on 1, followed by normally a Fire the Cannons to take out a character, and then any other 1-drop, whether it be, any of these 1-drops aside from a second Maleficent, which would be obviously the nuts. That play no longer exists. And since that play no longer exists, when you go turn 1 Maleficent on the play, turn 2 Baboom, it's just not the same thing. It's really just nowhere near close to the same amount of lore. It's nowhere near threatening. Your opponent in most cases is pretty comfortable taking 4 lore from Maleficent early. Almost every deck has a 2-drop that they're completely fine playing. So Maleficent on average is never going to get more than 4 lore unless, it's turn 1 Maleficent, turn 2 Baboom, turn 3 Metamim, pick up Maleficent. But in that case, we've only gained 4 lore, and our turn 3 play was only put 3 lore into play, which means going into turn 4, we're only representing 7 lore. And that is just not enough to win games, if I'm being completely honest. So the lines on the play became much weaker without Fire the Cannons. They became harder to close out games without the library. Honestly, Friends on the Other Side is a great card when you can sing it, but on average, our deck doesn't want to sing cards. So therefore, it didn't really feel like this was a good replacement to library. We were better off just playing 2 of these and still playing 4 library, just to get that extra lore on average and give ourselves a better position to draw more cards. Just didn't happen. Missing Fire the Cannons. There was just a lot, honestly, just a lot that was mispredicted with this deck. And I think that that's like the core fundamental lesson here is, you can see a metagame, you can be excited about it with the lack of steel, the success of Ruby Amethyst, the success of Ruby Sapphire, and even Amethyst Emerald. You can come out of that and going, oh, I can take advantage of this. I can remove Pete from my deck. I can remove Smash from my deck. I can get rid of those cards that are problematic. The thing about Baboom, which I'm going to talk about in the next list, was that without Ursula 3 as prevalent in the metagame, without Ariel as prevalent in the metagame, the Babooms were theoretically better than Smash because they offered you conditional ways to remove characters after the fact. Smash was all about removing a character before it could challenge, before it could quest or sing and things like that, because that was deemed necessary at the time. If we're getting away from those characters, it's not as important. It's okay for us to move the game forward, gain more lore, force our opponent to challenge us, and then utilize a character or utilize a card like Baboom to finish off a character that challenged us. It is very good in practice, but it's not very good if you don't have any way to interact before they challenge. So not having Fire the Cannons to save our one-cost characters was pretty massive, and it was definitely a downfall of this list all in all. So it's one of those things where we missed. That's okay. It happens sometimes. We got to just move forward, and we got to talk about other ways that it could have been successful. So we're going to look at a couple other decks, and then we're going to talk about the final deck of where the decisions are being made and understanding what is necessary in the current metagame for Doc Aggro. All right, so this was the Amethyst Steel burn that we were testing a little bit beforehand and kind of theory crafting this deck a bit. You can see no Pascal in this, just the 15 1-drops. The 2-drops still had Mr. Arrow at the time because it did feel pretty well positioned on average. We did drop a Fox, or only playing 3 Foxes, which is pretty familiar from old list. Having Merlin, having 4 Merlin, 4 White Roses, just having another way to gain conditional lore, because as you can see here, this deck also is playing Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom again. So this list was definitely a little bit more able to make the reach out of the game, having the 4 Rose, having the 4 Merlin, along with Befuddle to redraw our docks and things like that post-docking. And then, of course, Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom to finish out games with 4 Library as well. The key factor here was 4 Fire the Cannons, 4 Baboom. As I was just talking about before, is that you were creating these ways that we still could have our best opening hands with Maleficent, plus a Fire the Cannons, plus any other 1-drop. So that was threatening the most lore on average. Then being able to pick up on turn 3, either play a library, sit back for a turn, or continue the game going forward with the Mr. Arrow and another 1-drop when possible. Any of those times we can threaten that much lore very early on out of our 1 and 2 cost cards, it set us up in the best position to win with White Roses, with Merlins, and of course with Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom. This gave us the ability to win on the draw on average. This was definitely a better, well-positioned deck in general in terms of trying to find ways to win on the draw, because in a best of 3 format, when we're playing in set championships, when we're playing in the LCQs, it's best 2 out of 3. If you lose a die roll, you have to be able to win a game on the draw. I think the deck that we designed for CCS simply wasn't that. The deck could not win on the draw very easily at all. It kind of honestly needed your opponent to just fold in a way. So because of that, we needed to, make sure that we have cards and understand why we're playing specific cards to try and win on the draw. Cards like Befuddle to get rid of, really annoying snakes, really annoying Calhouns and things like that is very important. Even bouncing a Tipo when necessary. Very often, Sapphire decks are utilizing Tipo rather than Staliazarite Sea against us. If we don't have Fire the Cannons, and we only have cards like Baboom, it feels pretty bad to spend both our resources to remove card for card, remove a card like Tipu. If we can just simply befuddle it early, bounce it back to their hand, and then move the game forward, it feels a little bit better, a little more safer. Same thing goes for Cinderella, any other nuisance 2-drops. Befuddle is also very good against snakes. Snakes being prevalent in the metagame is huge because Amethyst is everywhere. So just another way to kind of interact with Snake is very big as well, because they technically committed 3 resources to that Snake already. So paying 1 kind of prevents almost a full 2 turns from them with cards like Snakes. Also takes away Fox. Does a lot of really formidable things for you that make a lot of sense. But all in all, this was the list that, we didn't play. We went with the other one to kind of give it a full test, understand a little bit better as we are preparing for Continentals. We're trying all different sorts of things, trying to see what sticks and trying to learn from that. But this version, I do think, is definitely a little bit better positioned on average to win on the draw. It's a little bit easier to play. It's much more straightforward. So if you're looking for like the most straightforward version of this list, then I would go and say that this Amethyst Steel Burn version is a very, very good option for you. A lot less critical thinking involved, a lot less setup. It's just more or less open your hand and play your cards on average. So we don't need to be too crazy about the lines and scripting of the way we're playing the cards. It's more or less like, all right, we open our hand, we understand the plans, we understand the way that we play through the deck, and that's kind of what we're going to do. Let's look at the next list, though. So another way that we've built this deck in the past is based on Yen Sin. Now, Yen Sin is a great character in the Disney Lorcana Meta Game. Having 3 willpower is pretty incredible, and having the ability to draw cards because of Magic Brooms makes it all the more wild. There is worlds where this card also gains you 3 conditional lore, which is basically a 1/3 Piglet if you can line up the Brooms correctly. So what this deck did is that it was able to give you a better reach from behind in a more inkable manner, and another card that's and another character that was easily repeatable, similar to Doc, to draw you conditional cards. The whole concept here is having one Turnabox Followers, Diablo, Magic Broom, Yensid, Doc, and then, of course, Library to turn every card into an effective Diablo was the concept of this deck of just continuously maintaining your hand to draw as many cards on average to continuously pressure the game. The problems with this deck, of course, we are still running the exact same package. We did go down a little bit here. We went to 2 Befuddle, 2 Gathering Knowledge of Wisdom, but we still have the 4 Fire the Cannons, 4 Baboon. That's still that same strategy and same synergies of saying, hey, I need to be able to remove the board when necessary, pick off characters when necessary, and things like that. That's what these 2 cards are covering for you. And the rest of the deck is very similar to the list we just covered. Of course, we are going down on Madam Mims again, trying to make room because we had to find a way to make 4 Magic Brooms possible. We're still playing 2 Mr. Arrows in the deck. Everything else remains the same, 15 1-drops, your standard normal of 2 drops, except now we include Magic Broom. And then we went down to 2 Roses and 3 Merlins. All of this, again, is based on the idea that our cards are consistently going to kind of sift through, keep us drawing cards, and keep the game manageable as a way to close out the game with a nice pop from a 3 lore when necessary, continuous draw through Doc, and then, of course, finishing the game with Gathering Knowledge Wisdoms, Merlins, and White Roses. The issue with this deck in general is that, sometimes it doesn't line up. Maybe we don't see a Magic Broom on 1. Maybe we don't see a Magic Broom on 2. When we're doing that and we have Yen Sin in our hand, it does kind of look a bit clustered. It's not the end of the world if you have to just play your 1/3 into play and not draw a card. But of course, he is at his best when you're able to draw a card. On average, we're not really ever expecting to gain 3 lore from Yensid. It's more of a happy accident. It's more like, hey, it's really great if we can assemble this kind of line and then, really create ways to win the game that way. 1-cost Broom in the Yensid into Magic Broom on 3 with another 1-drop to gain as much lore as possible is really wonderful. Even a world where, Yensin can come in and then we can befuddle a snake or something like that on turn 3 to kind of keep our opponent off, gain 3-4 lore from the Broom and the Yensid, and then protect our Yensid from cards like Fox and Snake is also pretty huge. So there's a lot of things that really work well about this list, but it is a little more difficult to play because you need to line up things better. You need to mulligan more specifically. So if you like the kind of idea where you're consistently replenishing your hand when everything is running well, when we're cycling through correctly, then this version of this deck, I think, is a very good version. And, it really can come together and can just kind of get you through the game in a consistent manner. And hey, if you're a Broom fan, all the more plus. Obviously, this is very, very similar to the last list. The only core differences here is that we are trying to be a wizard in Brooms. But this is just another version of it. I wanted to showcase and kind of talk through what Yensid has to offer. Let's get into the next deck list, though. So one of the other earlier versions that we were testing leading into EU Sisu was a Yen Sin deck, but it was a bit bigger of a list. As you can see here, we add John Silver, we add Pete's, we add Genies. We still have the Roses and Goats, and we're also back on Cannons and Smash, along with a lone fairy ship. So this was one of the lists that were being tested earlier, and we actually had a couple people in our Discord that said they were very successful with the list. They said they really liked John Silver, and I really want to include this as the proof of concept deck list. You know, we had people that were going to leagues, participating in leagues and winning their leagues with this deck and versions of this deck. So I really wanted to just say, like, hey, John Silver is definitely a card that I think is a little bit underrated in the Amethyst Steel decks. It's really difficult to say how good he is in terms of comparing him to opposing, or I'm sorry, in terms of comparing him to other 3-drops. You know, when you look across the board, you can say White Roses is probably better than John Silver on average. You can say that Pete is potentially better than John Silver on average. There are other 3-drops, such as ones that we're going to look at in our next deck list, that are definitely good options here. You know, Fox is obviously on average the best option. So when you start thinking about how can I put John Silver in my list, well, it is definitely games where you go turn 1 Maleficent, you get away with it. You go turn 2 Smee. Your Smee gets the quest freely. They're making decisions between Maleficent and Smee. And then on your turn 3, you can actually like quest again with our Smee or Maleficent, whichever the one they traded for, and then John Silver to prevent and save your characters. The other keynote here is that John Silver is a captain, so Smee doesn't take any more additional damage when we have John Silver in play, which is very difficult for us to do in this in combination with playable captains, I would say. So that's a nice little niche thing to add. Also does a really well job of protecting Fairy Ship late. Obviously, protecting Library is huge as well. So this was a bit, of this more aggressive start, but kind of closing out the game with a little bit different of 3-drops. I would say that after this weekend, I would probably change Smash for Strength, but we're going to be discussing that in a moment. But all in all, you can see that these are the different versions of this deck. There are lots of different ways to build this deck. And that's kind of like the key factor here, is before I get into the final preparations of NAC testing, is that this deck has a ton of options. The only way you're going to get through is by learning to lose. Sometimes you're going to try stuff out and it's not going to work, and that's okay. I went into CCS. I started 2-0. I started 0-2. I lost to Amber Steel. We're going to lose that matchup. I lost to a bigger Amethyst Steel evasive deck where I'm not kidding. My opponent shifted Archimedes on turn 3, and I just said, yeah, I'm dead. I can't interact with that card. My opponent can just gain 20 lore with his Archimedes, and I think I will never, ever beat it. So that is things that you obviously don't prepare for on average, but it has to happen for you to learn from it. It has to be seen, so in order for you to understand how to kind of like work towards a better way to play this deck. So that's why I showed you all these different versions, because there is a lot of versatility in this in combination. But without that, we're going to talk about the final version of this list and why we are kind of slotting in a bunch of new cards and really changing the way, kind of like how this deck, I think, has to operate in the 2 out of 3 metagame for set champs and for the LCQs. All right, so we can see here that there's a definite change within this list. We already see that Happy has made its way in. Having the now 19 one-cost characters is a pretty big and pretty aggressive deck. We went down on Mana Mims because we want to find room for Calhoun's. We also still have our 4 Docs. So our uninkable count in this list is 14, which I think is a safe number for this list in general. Having Maleficent, Calhoun, Doc, along with still having Gathering Knowledge Wisdoms and Fire the Cannons. So this list is definitely more of a bold knight list, and this is all because we are going to find room for a couple 7 dwarves mines, along with still playing our 4 libraries. So we have 6 locations. We have our 2 songs, along with our 2 Fire the Cannons. Effectively, we still have 8 removals in the deck. We're just finding different ways to utilize them. Fire the Cannons, Strength, and Mines. Right now, Strength of the Raging Fire feels like a very safe card to play because there just are less Emerald Ursulas in play. Also, on average, most Emerald Ursulas are going to be inked against us. Obviously, the 1-3 stat line is fine, so maybe they do just put it into play and see our hand. But if we're only playing 2 of them, we're not really reliable for it being our opening. We'd also make sure we're mulling in this card away against Emerald decks. But in general, this is the list of what we're trying to do, and here is why. The key factor here that I learned this past weekend is that this deck needs to operate in a way that it can win on the draw. It's great when you can win every game on the play. Tell Amber Steel players this. Amber Steel players, for the longest time, once the win die rolls, wants to punish opponents, and just wants to win games, which is great. It's definitely easy to do. You definitely are favored on average on the play. The problem right now is there's not a lot of good ways to win on the draw with this deck. So we had to redesign this list to be able to compete on the draw. And that's why you're seeing some of these cards in this list. Having Calhoun as a kind of like a benchmark card that, opponents hate seeing, and they want to slow down the moment this card comes into play. They need to make different plays kind of see through the game a little bit differently. Having Tinkerbell Fast Flyer in the list is just a credence to having some evasive character in the list that's important, because Tinkerbell plus Merlin gives us the option to remove genies. So if on turn 3 we get a Tinkerbell, on their turn 4 they get a genie, we now have the option to say, okay, our turn 4 is going to be John Silver, prevent their genie from being able to challenge our Tinkerbell, and then just quest with Tinkerbell really safely. So that way we get to gain 2 lore out of our Tinkerbell, we have it protected because of John Silver, and then when they quest with the next turn, we get to play our Merlin and take out their genie. This is a really big deal because this is the only real good way we have to it. We also have other options, obviously. We have a Happier Doc into the mines and then a Fire the Cannons. Of course, we also have Flood the Board and just sing Strength of a Raging Fire. So there are other options now that give us outs to Genie. But before, the biggest issue is that evasives in this deck are really problematic. And for what it's worth, I'm not saying that just playing 3 Tinkerbells is going to be enough of a way to compete in all of the Genie Wars, but at least it's giving us an out on the draw. Whereas before, we simply didn't have one. So these cards, you might be able to see them go up higher in numbers. They might even be more important than gaining the extra lore with White Roses or with Goat. So there's a world where you see this card go down to a 2 and this card go down to a 2. Maybe this card go down to a 2. Madame Mim, Merlin, and White Roses are all potential cards that would go down, just to make room for additional evasive characters, maybe even a world where we start thinking about our own genies. Genie is a card that I don't think is that bad, but I also think you'd have to make more decisions about what we're getting rid of. If we want to play a genie, we're already at 14 Inkables. We might have to get rid of a Doc just to put a genie in our deck. So there's a lot of really hard cases to do that. I think that this is the best idea right now of where I want to be going into the metagame. I will definitely be happy to win on my die rolls, be aggressive as possible, have the starts that we want to, mulligan for those aggressive hands, get out our Docs early, which is great. But cards like Crab, cards like this Tinkerbell, cards like John Silver, and cards like Strength and Mines are definitely ways that we need to have to be able to interact with the board when we're behind in games. The list before, it just did not have a way to interact. That was the key factor here, is the last chapter of the thing was very much like, yeah, I want to do all these things, and they make a lot of sense, but in practice, they just didn't follow through. The deck couldn't win on the draw, and if you can't win on the draw, then you can't reliably play the deck. So we need to find ways to make this deck playable as possible on the draw to steal games when we lose dice rolls. So that's where we're at. This is the final list of what we're kind of working with right now to test for NACC. Thank you guys so much for watching today. If you found this video helpful, hit me up in the comments below. Let me know what version that you've found most useful. If you haven't yet, you can always click the link in our description to our Dreamborn. They're all on there, so you can see all these deck lists for yourself and kind of manipulate them, duplicate them, whatever you want to do with them. And lastly, if you like videos like this, breaking down archetypes, this is the first one I'm doing. And obviously, we're Doc enthusiasts on this channel, and we give Doc a big up on occasions. But right now, if I'm being completely honest, Amethyst Steel Doc might not even be the best Doc deck. Amber Steel Doc seems to be very well positioned right now. It's also pretty favorable into this list. So there's a world where instead of being Amethyst Steel Doc, you might actually want to be Amber Steel Doc. So if you're looking for more about that list, it was in the last recent meta report. So definitely check that one out there. Thank you guys so much for watching today, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.